Hi everyone, I'm Matt Young with Pint Science Nottingham, and today I'm here with Professor Philip Moriarty of the School of Physics and Astronomy. So today we're just going to talk to you a little bit about how you got to where you are.
Good.
So starting straight off, the big question, what got you interested in science?
So I think when I talk to PhD students and other researchers in the group, sometimes they can't really pinpoint a particular event. For me, I can pinpoint an event which was, my uncle was a radio amateur, used to dabble a lot with transmitters and receivers and sort of CB radio and have a call sign and all that type of stuff. And he and I, when I was quite young, used to build, I was 8 or 9, used to build little circuits. We'd get pieces of wood and we'd put drawing pins in the wood, and we put the component leads under that, and we build up circuits that way. And one thing we built was something called a crystal radio. So that's just like 4 components. It's really straightforward. And for an aerial, you just use a big long wire, and we lived in the heart of the country, so you could have a like 100-meter long wire. And then for a ground, you connect it to the radiator in the room. And you put the earpiece in. There's no power source. There's no battery. You don't connect it to the mains. You just put the power source. And what drives it are the radio waves themselves. So literally the air drives it. And so I remember putting this thing in after building it, just putting it in. We took 15 minutes or so to build it, putting the earpiece in, and then hearing a radio station. I was then realizing actually what's driving it is the radio waves, the invisible radio waves around us. That was a sort of pivotal moment, I would say.
Well, if more of us had such an experience, I'm pretty sure we'd all be more amazed in jumping into science. So when you were younger, did you have any role models or people that you would see in popular culture that you associated with science and that maybe influenced you at all, whether they were scientists or not?
Yeah, certainly. So there was always Patrick Moore in the sky at night. There was, from my generation's, Brian Cox was a guy called Carl Sagan in Cosmos, and that was a major influence. Science fiction, Star Trek, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, although not science, but they were also, I think, a major influence in terms of just, you know, if I can say it, the sort of nerdy, geeky side.
So, talking about these sort of like big discoveries and talking about the big things compared to the little things, in your time being a scientist, have you had any big learning moments, not necessarily big discoveries, but any big learning moments that have really stuck out for you along the way?
That's an interesting question. I guess one of the things that drives you as a scientist is discovering new things, and there's nothing like sort of you're in the lab at 2 o'clock in the morning or something and you see something nobody else in the world, or perhaps nobody else in the universe has ever seen before. That can be that can be real inspiration. And unfortunately those events come along fairly rarely, but you're willing to put up with an awful lot of crap to get to that point. In terms of key learning, major events where I've really learned something, certainly there's nothing like having to stand up in front of 200 undergraduates. And so, for example, for a number of years I taught a course in thermodynamics. Now, as an undergraduate, I did thermodynamics courses and I did the exams, etc., etc. But I did not understand vast swathes of thermodynamics until you have to stand up in front of 200 undergraduates and give a lecture.
I think that's a really good point to make, is that you don't realize truly how well you understand something until you have to teach somebody else.
Precisely.
You know, which is, I think, why it's also quite important for a lot of scientists these days to get more involved in projects such as this, to talk about their work, because it doesn't just help the wider public, it helps them as well.
Agree entirely. And you know, I speak at international conferences in the field. You go to various places and you talk to people, and they'll ask you very technical questions. The most challenging questions I've had by far are events like Pride Science and things like Skeptics in the Pub and Cyber and these type of things, where you get these completely because they're not technical questions and they're out of your field and they're much more general questions. You really have to sort of step back and think, how am I going to address this? How am I going to explain this? And it's by doing that, you're helping your research, you're helping your science, you're helping your ability to explain things as a teacher. So,
even though you've come all this way and you've created this career for yourself as a scientist, what would you be doing with yourself if you weren't a scientist right now?
I'd either be a really terrible musician or I'd be in sound engineering. I'd be working in a studio. In fact, that was before I decided to do a PhD. That's where I was going to go. And
that's really interesting because a lot of scientists we've spoken to, we find that, and myself included, they have a music background or they have a prior interest in music, which is very interesting. And then obviously the very well-known Brian Cox,
yes,
before he became a physicist, had his own band.
He did, and indeed he played in a band called Dare. So everybody knows about Dream, but before he was in Dream, before I was in a band called Dare, and the person who set up Dare was a guy called Darren Wharton, who was the keyboard player in Thin Lizzy, and I was a huge Thin Lizzy fan. So it's Brian's one step removed from one of my favourite bands. So I have a huge amount of time for Brian, huge amount. And there are very deep links between quantum physics and rock music, and we could spend a lot of time talking about them, but I might mention them during the Pint of Science talk.
So does that mean you have an idea of what your potential band would be called, were you to make music?
Oh, no, now you've put me on the spot. Not off the top of my head, no, that's a good question.
I was just wondering if it would be quantum physics themed.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
So give us an idea of what your average day in the lab is like. An average day at work, what is it you get up to? Is it all the same? Does it really change?
Yeah, it changes every day, and it was interesting that you worded the question and then slightly changed it, because I would love to say that I spend a lot of time in the lab. I don't. What happens is, so in terms of the career pathway, you do your undergraduate, then you do a PhD. PhD, you're in the lab all the time. Then you do some postdoctoral research. After that, you're in the lab all the time. Then you become a lecturer, and for the first few years you're in that lab a heck of a lot because you're setting it up. Then as you get, grants start coming in, you can start to employ postdoctoral researchers. And then what happens is that you start to move away from the lab, and the postdoctoral researchers do the actual hands-on research, and the PhD students, of course. In terms of writing proposals, in terms of contributing to development of papers, in terms of analysing the data, that type of stuff you do. But the hands-on side of things, unfortunately, I think most academics would say this tends to, you tend to spend less time. I was lucky that a few years ago I had a fellowship, which meant that I could dedicate myself pretty well or full-time to research. But typically you divide your time up between research, teaching, administration, and the teaching side I love.
It's quite interesting to note that, because a lot of people don't really understand where scientists at different stages in the career are and what they are doing, so it's good to know that. But sort of looking at like a more personal level and what it takes to be a scientist, a lot of people will think, oh, to be a scientist you have to be some crazy smart-eccentric person. But for you, what is it that you think it takes to be a scientist?
Two things: enthusiasm and tenacity. The willingness to sort of bang your head against a problem and really stick at it until it hurts.
Well, thanks very much, Philip.
Okay.
If you want to hear more from Philip Moriarty and what he does in the School of Physics and Astronomy, don't forget to check him out at our Atoms to Galaxies themes at Pint of Science Nottingham, 23rd to 25th of May. We'll see you there.